Good evening and welcome everybody to our live stream tonight with the Oklahoma Conference of Churches on the topic, Is America a Fundamentally Racist Nation? Now, I know that's a very exciting topic to use as a title of a program, and we will get to that in just a moment. But I first want to thank the Oklahoma Conference of Churches for hosting tonight's program, live streaming on all their platforms, and including this very important topic as a priority in a list of the many diverse issues that they cover, including interfaith discussion, including many other issues that are important to make Oklahoma a better place for each and every one of us. And I'd like to start by having all of our panelists introduce themselves. Let's start with the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, the Reverend Dr. Shannon Fleck. If you'll take just a minute to introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, you just did it, Adam. They now know my name. They know my role. They know everything about me. But
tell us something I didn't say.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm Shannon Fleck. I'm the Executive Director of OCC. I've been doing that for about 3 years now, which is shocking. It's really flown by. I'm an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, but clearly in this role, I have a strong passion for social justice, inclusivity, and using the Bible to work across all lines, be that race, gender identity, sexual orientation, class, faith. We work interfaith, we do it all. So that's just a little bit more about me.
I'm muted, my bad. Okay, Alicia, can you please introduce, and I'm not gonna introduce people anymore with their titles, so that way you can. Alicia, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alicia Priest. I'm a 26-year career educator. I taught Spanish and English language learners, and I currently serve as the president of the Oklahoma Education Association.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Professor Lawrence Ware, can you please introduce yourself?
Well, you just introduced me. My name is Lawrence Ware. I am a professor of philosophy at Oklahoma State University. I'm also associate director, my title just changed, associate director of the Center for Africana Studies. I'm also an ordained minister in the Progressive Baptist National Convention, but mostly I'm here to talk about race and racism, which I write about and I teach at Oklahoma State University, so happy to be here.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And John Waldron. I'm not going to say your title because everyone is accusing me of introducing them already.
Well, there's a saying, you can never insult somebody by calling him doctor, but call him representative, and that might be fighting words. So I'm State Representative John Waldron from House District 77. And in happier days, I was a public school social studies teacher at Booker T. Washington High School. Go Hornets. And let's see, I have written a lot about this issue, House Bill 1775 and the critical race theory debate on my Facebook page, Waldron for OK, if anybody wants to do their assigned reading and read the essays I put up there. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really honored to be here with such a distinguished panel.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I think Representative Waldron, he said something very important that we need to bring up. There have been headlines across the news as of late. Critical race theory being banned in states across the country, Oklahoma, of course, Florida, and many others. So before we get any further into the discussion, Representative Waldron, can you define for the audience what is critical race theory? And is this something being taught in the classroom based on your experience?
No and no. Well, when it comes to critical race theory, it's a very big concept that suggests that race is an inherently important part of history, and that you can't understand American history in particular if you don't understand the role that race plays in it. And then there's various permutations about critical race theory. The legislation we passed this year did not mention critical race theory, but it was certainly at the heart of the debate, as legislators used that as a straw man and a punching bag to attack a bunch of things they said that they didn't like about schools. In practice, critical race theory is not taught in our K-12 schools, though the Oklahoma academic standards do include necessarily and inevitably discussion of the role that race has played in our history.
Okay. Would anyone like to add to that, or did that cover it? Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Representative Waldron, for that. So before we get to bringing up some of the quotes that came out during the debate on House Bill 1775 and talking about that specifically, this was actually not the first bill proposed in the Oklahoma legislature that tried to make changes to the way that race and racism is taught in the classroom. So actually, prior to that, there was a bill that was proposed that didn't actually make it to the Senate floor by Senator Shane Jett, and it would ban teaching, essentially, according to a KFOR article, ban the teaching of divisive concepts concerning race in schools. And the author specifically, Senator Jett, said, America has become too preoccupied with the color of people's skin. Again, America has become too preoccupied with the color of people's skin. We'll get that quote on the screen. Let me just put it here. And so I would like to turn it over first to Professor Ware. Is this, what do you have to say about this statement? What is your comments here?
Okay. Okay. I'm trying to be measured in what I'm saying here. Okay. So the notion that America is too preoccupied with the color of people's skin is a true statement. That Senator Jett is telling the truth. The reality is that America has always been preoccupied with the color of people's skin. America has written into laws. The very first Senate bill that was written into law in Oklahoma, when Oklahoma became a state, was a law that instituted segregation. So yes, absolutely. He's absolutely right. Congratulations. Good job, Senator Jett, that America is preoccupied with the color of people's skin. However, what he's trying to say is that America is preoccupied because we're pushing back against racism. I don't understand the notion. Okay, I've been living in Oklahoma my entire life, and I'm very frustrated with this state. And I've been frustrated with this state for 39 years now. And I'm 39. Because the reality is that what the legislators are trying to do is they're trying to say that because, and this is all reactionary to what happened last summer. So if you remember last summer, you had the whole discussion about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. So this is all reactionary to that. And what they're trying to say is that is when America became too preoccupied with the color of people's skin, as opposed to going back to the very foundation, 1619, 1921. Like those were the times where we need to be talking about the preoccupation. So he's right, and it's frustrating, and I'm trying not to get angry right now. But the bottom line is that he's right about that, but he's right in the wrong way, in all of the wrong ways. I'll let everybody else get in on that.
Okay. Reverend Shannon Fleck, I think you're shaking your head a lot, so I feel like you have something you'd like to add.
Well, amen to that. I was also going to say just some version of he's flipping the comment and utilizing something that is not relevant right now. We have always had this preoccupation, and now we're too preoccupied because a year ago people rose up and demanded better. It's also important, I think, to realize that this bill was not authored in the state of Oklahoma. This was a nationally written bill that was filtered down through the states nationwide to be passed. So this is a national level effort I agree with Professor Ware, to squash the racial progress that has been made in our country. And this is the national response. And Oklahoma just happened to be one of the states that took the bait and passed this bill.
I'm going to say this real quickly. What he's saying, what's essentially happening here is he's comfortable with being preoccupied when Black people are the people who are the targets. But he's not comfortable with being preoccupied when we're now pushing back and now white people are the targets. And that's what makes it so frustrating and so irritating to me.
Absolutely. And Reverend Fleck, you said something very important that I think a lot of people need to realize, because in Oklahoma, we saw the same thing with State Question 755 about 11 years ago in 2010, or better known as the anti-Sharia law. That bill and that language, I should say, state question, that was the same language we saw it proposed in states across the country. And so when you hear, like, I think it was just this past week in the news, you hear Florida's banning the teaching of critical race theory. You look at the bill language and it's identical. So yes, it's important to recognize that. Alicia and Representative Waldron, I would like to ask you, kind of going off the same question, is within the public school system and amongst teachers and educators, how would you say the teaching of race and racism is it being done justice? Are we lacking in the educational system in terms of teaching the reality of race and the history of racism in America?
Well, I think that some are doing it justice and some are doing a disservice. You know, my own daughter came home from school a couple of years ago, and I was reading her essay on Indian Removal Act, and it said that a certain tribe was assimilated better into culture because they sent their children to boarding schools. So that is not an accurate reflection in any manner of what happened. And so I had the opportunity to have a discussion with her about that. So that's an example of what is not going right. But there are so many examples of what teachers are doing right to help promote the thought within their schools and within our system of education and with their students to talk about our history in real concepts, in the reality of, of Jim Crow laws and social and racial justice and how that continues to affect our Black and brown brethren.
Thank you. And Representative Waldron, same question. And to add to that, how much is the legislator helping or hindering progress in this regards?
Oof. Okay. Yeah. All right. You added a bunch to that one. Okay. So first of all, a lot depends on the quality of the teacher in the classroom. And we need to guarantee that there are qualified teachers in every classroom and that they can use well thought out academic standards to teach American history. I mean, you've got to talk about the slavery and its role in the Civil War. You got to look at Reconstruction and its failure, the rise of Jim Crow. Otherwise, the Civil Rights Movement doesn't make any sense. If we have a healthy education system, then we have a chance to make those things work better, particularly if the new teachers we're recruiting look more like the students in the classroom. So then the second part of it is meeting the students where they are. You might say that we're too preoccupied with the color of skin of people's skin, but students bring their identities to the classroom, and they want to know that the history we're teaching them is not just the story of a lot of white guys in the past, but that it's our story, that it's our common story, and that includes telling the stories of people who look like our students. So you've got to talk about race, or otherwise it's not going to be relevant in the classroom. Now, are the legislators helping or hurting? That's pretty easy. We're really getting in the way of teachers. I've seen 3 legislative sessions, and this one tops it so far in legislating to teachers how they should be teaching. It's been an all-out attack on teachers and social studies teachers in general by a bunch of people who have no desire to work in the classroom themselves. And they've used teachers as straw dogs so that they can advance their agenda about the scary things that Marxist educators are doing in the classroom. Yeah, and thanks, by the way, for reminding me of that time back in the day when we were all scared of Sharia law. I forgot how terrifying that briefly was before we moved on to the next bugbear.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's really sad that we live in a country that fear drives so much, and people I say people, I should say those in power, and not all in power, but many of those in power, in political power, they use and take advantage of this fear and the ignorance that people have to spread misinformation. But let's move on to something I pulled from the House bill. We're about to bring it up on the screen. Now, essentially, the House bill, 1775, you can look it up, you can read the language for yourself. It says a teacher cannot teach the following in the classroom, and I want to get reaction from the panelists on this. It says the teacher cannot teach that an individual by virtue of his or her race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. So I would like to start again with Professor Ware and get your reaction to this. And the reason I'm curious to see what the panelists have to say is because I will say my personal experience. So I'm half white, half Iranian. And so when I talk to my mother and I hear about stories of my own grandparents and great grandparents and the things that they would say, you know, without giving it second thought, and the language they would use and the jokes they would tell, I do feel that I have a sense of responsibility to take that and do something with it. And I do feel a sense of sadness, perhaps shame, if you will, but not the type that makes me like depressed or feel like this overwhelming sense of guilt, but rather it motivates me to want to do something. But before I get too far along, Professor Ware, what is your thoughts?
Okay. All right. Let's do a sidestep and then we'll get back into this. So, race or sex. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that I am a man, and I feel a strong responsibility to do whatever I can to promote women, to promote people who are transgender, to promote anyone who has been marginalized by people who shared the same gender as me growing up. And so I feel a strong responsibility to do that. And so what this language is saying is that I should feel no responsibility to do everything that I can to promote women or promote whatever. And that's inherently wrong. Like, it just doesn't make sense to say that I am a man and I should take all the privileges of being a man and do nothing whatsoever to promote people who have been historically marginalized and people like me. The same is true when it comes to race, that there are certain privileges that people who are white, they just have. I mean, I can show a direct line from slavery through Jim Crow, through 80s, through 90s, all the way to now, to outline why so many white people tend to be doing so much better than people of color. A direct line. It's not even a question about how there are clear advantages of being a white person in this country, being a white person in this state, being a white person in this city. There are clear advantages. And so it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, of course, I'm not going to say, you know, Shannon, because you are a white woman, then I'm going to hold you responsible for the woman who, you know, set up Emmett Till. No, I'm not going to do that. But there are certain kinds of advantages that Shannon needs to be aware of. And as a professor of philosophy and of race here in the state, it's my responsibility to say, hey, you may not be responsible, but these are advantages that you get by being a member of this particular class of people. And so it drives me crazy and it makes me upset. And I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Reverend Fleck.
Yeah, you know, the Oklahoma Conference of Churches took it upon ourselves a couple of years ago to start offering white privilege trainings, because one of the things we were seeing as a huge barrier to the work of anti-racism was white people. Imagine that. And so we wanted to be on the front of that to help educate white people about this unseen privilege, because we don't know what we don't know. And when you have privilege, it's really hard to see it. And one of the things that happens when you call attention to white privilege with a lot of white people is that they become very angry and defensive. And look what's happened. We see people of color responding to what has been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years, and rightfully so, the response. But what we see is now a very angry response, because attention is being called to this unspoken privilege that exists. But no, if you're white, you have the privilege of not having to address it. You have the privilege of remaining ignorant to it, that's a privilege. The fact that you don't know that white privilege exists is a privilege, because I guarantee you every person of color knows white privilege exists. I guarantee you as a woman that sexism exists. It's a real thing. And so we've been in that work, consistently. This particular statement, I agree with Professor Ware that it's giving people an out from responsibility. Never growing up in our school system was I, as a white child, made to feel guilt over things that have happened in the past, but I have been taught a very whitewashed version of American history my entire scholastic career. Okay. And that's another thing to delve into, is that the curriculum we already have is whitewashed. And this just gives further permission to continue whitewashing. And if we're going to do that, then we're never going to draw the attention of white students to the realities of what they have that other people don't. And if I don't know what other people are going through, then I don't have responsibility or this sense of urgency to want to do something about it. And ultimately, I think that's exactly what this law is trying to do, is eliminate a sense of urgency and desire within young people to act for change and justice.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Thank you both for providing your thoughts on that. I want to pivot with Alicia and John, and I would like to change the quote on the screen to a quote from Representative Wendy Stearman, and this came out during the debate over House Bill 1775, but it relates to the quote we took straight out of the bill. And the quote says, "This bill removes from the classroom the indoctrination of students." So Representative Stearman was in support of the bill, and the question is, are students being indoctrinated? Are students being taught something? I mean, I think that's the sense that some wanted to convey, is that, oh, you're indoctrinating students to teach them that they're racist by virtue of the fact that they're white or something of that nature. So whoever would like to go first.
Oh, I'll take a stab at that. I guess I would start by saying that it's really hot out there, and so it's kind of a miracle that we should have so many white snowflakes around. The thing about my problem with that quotation is that the representative hasn't had her children in the classroom. They've been homeschooled. And actually, in her defense, they've been homeschooled because she is concerned about this. She's concerned that the public schools will indoctrinate her kids. But I would also question, how do you know that? There is a certain philosophy out there that government schools, which is what you call them if you don't like the public school system, is indoctrinating our kids. But the truth is that our teachers are just doing a job. They're just teaching the standards. Every teacher has an opinion, of course, but what that teaches students is that, oh, that teacher has an opinion. When you look at in regards to that previous quote, teachers are not going to be doing that. They're not going to be telling kids that you're responsible for something that happened 100 years ago, but they will tell you that what happened 100 years ago still shapes and informs the present. So if somebody were to come forward and say, well, you just violated 1775, I, as a teacher, would say, prove it. The trouble is that what we've done here is created an avenue by which students and their parents can allege indoctrination, can allege that teachers are making their students feel guilty. How do you prove that? But the point isn't to prove it. The point is to create this atmosphere of suspicion, to stoke the fears that some people already have of the government schools, because that serves an agenda. The cynical side of me, and I guess I've only been in the legislature 3 years, but the cynical side gets stronger every year. The cynical side of me suggests that that's an awfully big public education budget. And wouldn't there be a lot of money available if we just carved up the public schools and found ways to send more of those dollars off to private schools where they can teach whatever they want? You want to see indoctrination, take a look at what some of the things that are going on in some of our private schools. Take a look at some of the material that's being sold for homeschooling purposes. And you're going to find an awful lot of indoctrination. Some of it could end up getting paid for with public dollars, and do a lot of things that violate our Constitution.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. Alicia?
Yeah, I think that this quote is exactly like Shane Jett's quote earlier. We need to flip the script on that and look at what is really happening in our schools. And that is that historically, our curriculum has largely excluded the history of Black and Brown Americans. It is from a perspective of Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and he discovered America, and and ignores the fact that there were already people living here. So we have been indoctrinating students, but not in the way that she is necessarily saying. Just a few years ago, the legislature tried to get rid of AP US history for American exceptionalism. That nothing historically has been done wrong in America. And so we have to look at what is taught, and are we representing all of our students? And so I think we do need to remove the indoctrination of students in our schools, but not in the way that he's referencing.
Ooh, that is so well said. That's so well said. I also wanted to add something that just escaped my brain, so I'm going to stop talking now. But thank you, Alicia. I can't get over this government schools thing. Does that mean public schools? Are public schools the government school? Okay.
Government schools are public schools if you don't like them.
All right, Adam, take it away.
Well,
but one thing, I think there's a difference, if I can jump in here and start a conversation. I think there's a difference between indoctrination and educating. Because I teach my students, now I teach on a university level, and we don't necessarily go through critical race theory. I don't talk to them about Derek Bell, who's a very important person in critical race theory. We don't go through that necessarily. But I do teach through the lens of critical race theory, if that makes any sense. Because critical race theory it's not Black history, but it can be used to teach Black history, if that makes any kind of sense. It's not American history, but it can be used to teach American history. It's a lens through which you view the world, right? And so I do use that lens to teach my students. Now, just because I use that lens to teach my students does not necessarily mean that I'm indoctrinating them. I'm just educating them, right? And we need to kind of be clear about the difference between indoctrination and education, right? I'm not trying to teach my students to do really anything. I mean, the way that I teach, I never tell them what I think about anything. I just present both sides of it. When I'm teaching it, I have an idea about what I want, what I like, but I don't tell them that, right? But I'm trying to educate them. That's not me indoctrinating them. And so now, if when it comes to homosexuality, I teach them, hey, support LGBTQ, whatever. There's just clear things that you should support. You should be against racism. You should not be cool with that. You shouldn't be slavery was great. No, you shouldn't be doing that. So, there are certain things that I'm educating them about, but I'm not indoctrinating them. And that's one of the things that really bothers me, is that this language makes education indoctrination, and that's not the same thing, right? You're just educating people as opposed to indoctrinating people. As the representative said, the stuff that I read when the homeschoolers get their curriculum, that's indoctrination. The stuff that I hear from very conservative circles, that's indoctrination. Education is completely different, and it's important for us to make that very, very clear.
Wow, well said. Thank you.
If I can add a word, if government schools are public schools we don't like, then education we don't like, we call it indoctrination. And that's the politics of it.
Boom goes the dynamite.
I would like to add some comments on this, because I think you brought up some very important points. And when I teach my students at Oklahoma State University, and I teach them on the topic, so I teach Intro to World Religions, one of my favorite classes, because I feel like we're able to cover so much, and I can see my students going from this narrow vision of what religion is to a very broad encompassing idea towards the end of the semester. But the first thing I tell them is everything you've been taught about religion for most of you up until this point in your life has been taught from a very Eurocentric standpoint. You basically, as you mentioned, you get the whitewashed version of history or religion, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. And I challenge them to break free of that. And I think that's what we have going on in the schools now. As Alicia so well mentioned, students are being indoctrinated, but not in the way that this representative is trying to say. Look, I'm a Muslim. I'm the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations Oklahoma chapter. And I have had students come to me in tears, their parents scared for their children because their children are being called terrorists. They're being bullied because of their faith, because the schools don't teach, as Alicia mentioned, the history of Black and brown people in this country or in the world very well, and don't teach the fact that Muslims have been around in America since before even America was a country. And I'll give you one example just so people can understand some of the challenges that young Muslims face in the classroom. This is public knowledge. It's on our website and in the news. We have archives of it, but there was a high school girl, 9th grade. As everyone in 9th grade does, she took Oklahoma history class. The last day of Oklahoma history in May, this teacher, so they started, way back yonder, I don't know, with the Cowboys and the land run. And it's been a while since I did Oklahoma history, but they ended in 1995 with the Oklahoma City bombing. Okay. And so the last day of class, teacher said, I'm not going to teach, I'm going to show a video. It was a History Channel video. And I forgot the title of it, but it basically presented 10 conspiracy theories about who did the Oklahoma City bombing. 9 out of 10, it said that there's possibility that Muslims had something to do with it. Okay. And of course, we know who committed that horrific act of crime. But here's what happened. This young Muslim girl, she wears the headscarf. Her mother called me and said she came home in tears because she sat in the front of the classroom. She was a straight A student. And as soon as that video was over, she felt guilt while watching that video, not because of anything she had done, but she felt guilt because she knew the way that her peers would be looking at her once that video was finished. And when she turned around, she felt like the whole class was staring at her. And it took 3 months for us to convince Jenks Public Schools here in Oklahoma to remove that video from their school library. And it took a request that was originally denied, and we had to appeal it. But the point is, when you talk about indoctrination, what are we teaching our students, right? So I want to switch to a different quote, and we're going to kind of change gears a little bit as we get into the second half of this conversation. I want to put a quote from Representative Justin Humphreys, who was also opposed to the bill. And he said something very interesting that caught my eyes. And I would just like to see what response people have, because I think there is amongst a lot of Americans, and perhaps amongst a lot of white Americans, this notion that other people admire the United States because we had this civil rights movement. All of a sudden, everybody is on equal footing. I have my own opinions, but I will allow the panel to address that. So, Professor Ware, other countries look at us because we lead the way in civil rights. What is your feedback on that?
I mean, I would say that other countries might admire us because Black people have led the way when it came to civil rights, and that white people came along eventually, slowly and surely. I think that there is some truth there, that we have historically. Here's what I'm battling with. What I'm battling with is the fact that what I know in my mind is that every step that we've had towards racial justice has always been met with like a repercussion, right? A pushback away from racial justice. And so it's not one of those things where civil rights happened and everyone was like, oh man, that's a great idea. And everyone just adopted it, right? That's just not the way this country works. It's always been this push and pull. So last summer, when I saw all that was happening, when I saw that Nike released that statement in support of Black Lives, when I saw the Wrangler of all people release that statement in support of Wrangler jeans, released a statement in support of Black Lives, saying that the two Black people who wear Wrangler jeans, we support you. When that happened, that was a really good joke. No one's laughing, but that's fine. But when that happened, I knew that there was going to be a pushback. I just know the history of this country too well. I know that anytime there's any kind of step in the direction of racial justice, there's always going to be a pushback. So I guess that's a long way of saying that other countries may look up to us when it comes to civil rights, but what they're looking at is the end product and not the messiness of how we got there, right? And not the reality that there is still a long, long way to go when it comes to achieving civil rights. But that statement may be true, and I'm going to leave it here.
Well, and I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Shannon Fleck, but when I read this, okay, what I am reading into it is that he's trying to say, well, look at us. We're so accomplished in regards to this that, we shouldn't even be talking about race because we collectively have taken strides in the right direction. And a friend of mine.
Exactly.
I know. I'm just saying that's what he's saying. And a friend of mine who's originally Palestinian, who lived the majority of his life in the country of Jordan, he told me something, and I agree and disagree with what he said, but he said, I did not even know racism existed till I came to America. Now, I disagreed with him on that because racism does exist in every part of the world, and I've seen it with my own eyes. But I understood what he was saying in the sense that he didn't understand that the concept of systemic racism and how deeply embedded it is in society, that does not exist in all parts of the world. At least they don't talk about it. You know what I mean? They don't analyze it. They don't pick it apart. And maybe that's not good, right? But he did not have this understanding of racism till he came in America. So I just kind of leave that as food for thought. Reverend Fleck.
Yeah, no, I look at this quote and my initial thought is, I don't know. Like, I don't know if other countries are looking at us glassy-eyed thinking we have all the answers when it comes to civil rights. We have progressed since we, as white Europeans, captured and murdered Native Americans and Africans, to subjugate them for free labor for hundreds of years. So, white people had free labor that built this country that essentially gets ignored. And so that in and of itself is a racially systemic birth of a country that did not get eradicated at the end of slavery. African Americans, Native Americans were not given equal rights. They were not given equal rights at the end of the civil rights era. They continue to fight to be seen as equal in day-to-day lives. There have been minute moves toward restitution and reparations for people who literally built this country for free. That's a conversation that will send people spinning into offense. But if we're talking about true civil rights, if we're talking about true equality, if we're talking about true admiration for a country, then it should be under the lens of, no, we fixed what we broke. We fixed what we destroyed from the birth of it. And we haven't done that yet. We still have not done that. Regardless of the fact that Juneteenth is now a federal holiday, that does not mean that it's all wiped clean and is pretty, because we still have not made good on multiple promises that were made to people of color in this country. And so I don't know. I don't know if we are looked at admirably, because we still have a lot to do.
Alicia, John, would either of you like to chime in?
What have we learned from the Tulsa Race Massacre, which I didn't learn about in school, but even 100 years later, knowing that we wiped out the wealth and the opportunity that was so good and was building for the Greenwood District, we today can't even talk about reparations for that without an enormous amount of anger and angst. So have we had civil rights action in America? Yes. Are we the shining star of equality? I do not believe that we are there yet.
And I guess I would add that America has always had people at the center and people at the edges or the fringes. And they, at the center at the beginning, I think we can all acknowledge was a lot of property owning, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. And at the fringes was everybody else. And the people at the center don't yield power or extend rights on their own. Where do you think our civil rights accomplishments have come from? They've come from Native Americans and freed slaves and the Irish and drunk people and gay people, and sometimes gay drunk Irish women have advanced the cause of civil rights because they demanded that the center expand to include more and more of the fringes. And then you can still get into the trap that it's always an upward progression in American history towards greater and greater equality. Representative Humphrey's background is in corrections, and if anywhere, the heart of the new Jim Crow is in the over-incarceration of African Americans. So how can you say that? It's demonstrably provable that there are other societies with better civil rights records than the United States, and you can look it up in the Freedom in the World Freedom Atlas. The United States is an inspiration to a lot of countries around the world, but it's always been, as the Reverend Dr. Fleck said, an unfinished project and an ongoing struggle. And that's what we ought to teach the kids. That history doesn't end the day before they walk into class. They're walking into history, and they're going to continue a journey that we took on a long time ago.
Wow. So is it perhaps fair to say that the potential for America to be this civil rights beacon, if you will, is just that, it's potential, because we have a constitution that a lot of countries do not have, and because we have protected freedoms that allow for things like for us to protest for our rights and to fight for civil liberties and things of that nature?
Why, Adam, what a great way to empower students to make this country a better place.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to bring up a quote from Representative Denise Brewer, and she was in support of this bill. And you can probably tell by the quote. She said, "The economy will suffer greatly if we pass this." So she was obviously looking at it from an economic standpoint, but I will reframe the question. Perhaps you could even think of it in a broader sense. Is this a setback for us as a state and as a country if laws like this are being passed? Who would like to? Yeah, go ahead, Representative Waldron.
From the point of view of the legislature, it's a particular kind of setback I would call an annual setback, because every year we do stuff like this. When I was a teacher in the classroom, the impact I saw was that we sent the signal to a lot of our young people that Oklahoma is not for them. And they move and they take their talents elsewhere every time we do this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's an economic setback, and a long-term one too, because we lose all the potential of all these great Oklahomans who are told by their legislature every year that they don't fit in.
Okay.
Second, third, fourth, all of that. There are so many people that I have contact with that are like, I'm leaving Oklahoma. I'm getting out of here. It's not safe for me here. I can't be there, and I do not blame them. And that is sending a huge message. So I second everything the representative said. I don't know if the legislature considers that the future of Oklahoma is literally leaving the borders of Oklahoma because of the laws that are being passed.
Alicia?
I don't know that I can add anything to what Representative Waldron and Reverend Dr. Fleck said. I mean, that it's spot on. We look at our students are more and more going away to college and not coming back. We can look at our teaching force, and we are graduating fewer and fewer students, but also those students that were graduating are going out of state and not staying in state for to teach our kids. So it is it's a problem.
Okay. Professor Ware, would you like to add anything?
I mean, there's nothing much more for me to add. I mean, you guys know that everybody around us looks down on the state, and they look down on the state because of these kinds of laws. Many friends of mine refuse to come back to the state. Many people who are not, from this state don't want to come here. Like, I invite them to come and do panels, and like, oh, you're in Oklahoma, and it's not one of those silly things like, oh, you guys have horse and buggies like it used to be. It's more along the lines of, you guys have passed laws that clearly let me know that I'm not safe there and I'm not welcome there. And I'm talking about people who are people of color. I'm talking about people who are LGBTQ, plus. Like, I'm talking about all of these kinds of things. And so, yes, it is definitely going to be economic suffering is going to happen because of this bill, and not necessarily because of this bill, but because of the ethos that this bill represents, right? That lets them know that this is not a state where you can be safe and be a person of color here. Like, it just, you guys have already said it.
Well said. Well said. And I have the same discussions with Muslims who don't want to come to Oklahoma, even though the population of Muslims in the state has steadily grown over the years. But still, there are young Muslims that are ready to get out of here, get the heck out of Dodge, if you will, because they are just frustrated with this sentiment. As you said, it's not one specific thing, but it's just this overwhelming feeling that I'm not in a place where I'm readily accepted, and there's this movement in the wrong direction. And that kind of brings me to the last quote I'm going to pull up as we kind of near the end of this discussion, from Representative Sean Roberts. And he was, of course, against the bill, and he said something, and I just want comments from the panelists. He said, this sort of division is exactly what our country doesn't need right now. There's a lot that can be said about that. Let's start this time with Reverend Fleck.
Division is never what our country needs. Division's bad all the time, and yet we continue to sow it. We are the farmers sowing that field of division pretty consistently. And that's a big reason why OCC, the Conference of Churches, started our No Hate in the Heartland campaign. We started it in the fall to do exactly what we're doing tonight, to have the hard conversations, to help bridge divides, to help educate, to help have the conversations, to help show people that you can have the conversations in a civil way, and to really get into the difficulty of what is dividing people. Because we, as Christians, as a Christian organization, we'll start there. We're supposed to love everybody, period, end of sentence. And there's no requirement except that person exists. They exist on the planet right there in front of you, end of story. And yet we continue to bring up divisions. We continue to create divisions amongst ourselves through the laws we pass, through the culture we create, through the lessons we're teaching our children and handing down from generation to generation. We have to be committed to stopping that. We have to be committed to stopping this cycle of division and hatred. And that is at the core of everything we're trying to do. But of course, this division is not what our country needs right now. It's not what our country needs ever. You're muted, Adam, but I'm sure you're saying great things.
As always. Well said. Thank you, Reverend Fleck. I want to turn it over to Professor Ware, because I feel like I get this. I mean, I get people saying this to me as a Muslim, and I'm sure you understand where somebody who's white saying this is coming from. I feel like this is being said specifically, for example, last year when people took to the streets and we saw a lot of people of color, a lot of Black people on the streets protesting and rallying for their rights and, demanding an end to racial injustice and to police brutality. Then white people say, hey, we don't need division right now, right? Y'all are causing division by doing this. And I get it too, right? Oh, Muslims, you are causing division by saying we can't ban Sharia law, that we can't do this, we can't, So Professor Ware, what are your thoughts in context of that?
King wrote a letter, Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail. It's a very famous letter that you all should read if you have not read. And I'm talking not necessarily to people here. I'm sure you guys have read it. But people who are watching, you should read this letter if you can. And in that letter, one of the things that he's responding to was a criticism from white clergy, white ministers who wrote to him and said that you're causing division. And his response to them saying that you're causing division is that there's a difference between a negative piece and a positive piece. He doesn't say this directly in the letter, but this is the spirit of what he's saying. He expounds upon this later in a book called Why We Can't Wait. Anyway, so he expounds upon this. He says there's a negative piece and a positive piece. The negative piece is when it appears there's peace on the surface, but there's turmoil beneath the surface, right? So it appears that on the surface everything is peaceful, but beneath the surface there's segregation, there's lynchings, there's all these different things that are beneath the surface. And that's a difference between a negative piece and what he calls a positive piece. And what a positive piece is peace on the surface plus the presence of justice, right, at the same time. And what people tell me when they say that we don't need division is that they're wanting a negative piece. They want there to be injustice. They want there to be racism. They want there to be Black people who are killed by the police. They want there to be people treated unjustly, but just be quiet about it, right? Don't bring this up. Don't make me uncomfortable. Don't make me see this thing that I don't want to see. Well, the reality is that people of color, Black people, LGBTQ plus people, we're not silent anymore. Like we're telling our truth. We're telling you the reality that I myself, as a Black man in Oklahoma, I get pulled over probably once a month, and they pull me over and they check my stuff and realize that I'm fine. They let me go. What does that say to me? That says to me they pulled me over because I'm Black, right? And I'm driving a relatively nice car. And so we're just not being silent about that anymore. We're not hiding it anymore. There was once a time where my grandmothers and my mother used to tell me, just be quiet, suffer in silence, put up with it, deal with it. And I'm at a point where I'm like, no, I'm not doing that anymore. And I'm not teaching my children to do that anymore, because that does not give us justice. That if you want justice, you got to agitate for it. You got to push for it. You got to make people see the reality of your existence. And so what that tells me ultimately is that people want to go back to a world where justice is not present, but people are quiet. And that's just not going to happen anymore. And I don't think that should happen anymore. And so that's what I hear when people say we don't need division. Because the reality is that there is always injustice. There is always something happening, and you just don't want to hear about it. Well, that's just not a part of privilege anymore. Now you're going to be dealing with it. Now you're going to hear about it. Now I'm going to let you know about the reality of what I'm dealing with.
Wow. Amazing, and well stated, and very enlightening as well. Thank you so much. And I will just slightly adjust the question for Alicia and John. What is your take on bringing up these issues in the classroom, in an educational setting? And should there be some sense of discomfort, right? Division essentially is about, bringing up some sense of discomfort, challenging people, making them feel uncomfortable. So what is your take on that? Because I feel like what we have seen, and it's been a long time since I've been obviously in a K-12 classroom. I don't want to say exactly how long because I don't want to reveal my age, but the point is, what needs to happen, and how do we get to a point where we're having these uncomfortable conversations that can allow young people to grow and to really understand what they need to understand when it comes to race and racism in the classroom?
I'll go first if you want, Representative. We have to look at how we study history, and I'll tell you that we do not label students oppressor and victim. We have to give them information from all the perspectives. We have to have educators that look like our students. We have to have curriculum that reflects our students and reflects our diverse history. And we have to demonstrate to our students that these inequities don't define us, that we can talk about these differences, and that is not sowing division. That is having a conversation and learning from each other's realities. And that's how we learn, and that's what we do in school.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. I mean, the easiest way to mask division is to suppress dissent. And the only way to overcome division is to promote dialogue. So why do we have a legislation that censors teachers? I mean, this goes right back to the 1928 Scopes monkey case trial, which banned the teaching of evolution in defiance of the First Amendment. Now, in regards to being comfortable in class, I was never a big fan of being comfortable in class. I mean, if you're trying to get students to grow, growth is inherently uncomfortable. And if you're going to challenge people's whitewashed ideas about American history by suggesting to them that maybe that version of history does not explain the world we live in now, then kids are going to have to confront uncomfortable things. But I've always been a big proponent of telling the kids that you're old enough to handle uncomfortable topics and you're strong enough to figure out the truth for yourself. I mean, we're talking about whether America is fundamentally a racist country. And all too often in politics, racist as a term ends a conversation because we get locked into our sides. And what you're trying to do in a classroom is to begin a conversation. And the greatest trick you can pull off as a teacher is to get the kids started in that conversation and then step away so they forget you're even in the room because they're figuring it out on their own. And isn't that the American experiment?
Wow. Well stated. Well, we've covered a lot. Go ahead, Professor Ware. I see you want to add to that.
I just love Alicia's snapping. This is great. It makes me very happy.
I mean, Representative Waldron said something beautiful, and you're absolutely right. You know, I actually use questions strategically placed in my discussions on religion to get my students discussing topics that they probably wouldn't otherwise do. And it is wonderful to see them connecting the dots and to really expand their thinking. Well, as we end tonight's discussion, I'm going to end with an open-ended question. And we'll start with you, Reverend Fleck. And the question is, you know, we've talked a lot about race and racism and how it pertains to our state and the classroom, education, the future, covered a lot of topics in a very short span of time. The question I will leave you with is, what do you want to leave the audience with, and what kind of message of kind of where we go from here, or what are the next steps would you like to leave with everyone tonight?
Yeah, you know, I think I'll say to the topic, is America a fundamentally racist country? The answer to that is yes, but that can change. And we have to be active in that work. It's not going to change just by not talking about it. That's, as we have already addressed and discussed, that is not the solution. Regardless of how many laws or discussion topics shut the conversation down, that's not going to be the fix. This was a country that was birthed in racism, and that's a fact that we're never going to escape. So the answer then is we need to all, no matter your color, accept that as truth and work together to fix it, to make it truly whole, to provide true equity, because remember, we're not there yet. And if you're white, we need to be specifically committed to tearing down the systems that we have built, because it has been us that has constructed these systems of power and discrimination, and we need to be active in the work to tear them down. And so we are here as an organization to help along that journey. You can always reach out to us, but racism exists. It's real. We're living in it. We need to come together to fix it. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, and well said. Alicia.
Well, we can't bury our head in the sand and not talk about the existence of racial inequalities, hoping that it will go away. That is for sure. So by having conversations like this, by having good dialogue with one another, and by allowing ourselves to to see something from a perspective that we haven't lived is key in making the change in our hearts, change in our heads, and change in our society. And we have to do that. We have to look at the policies and procedures and laws that exacerbate the issue. We have to look at in education. We have to look at the policies that we put in place that add to the school to prison pipeline, that make our students feel marginalized by not letting them wear an eagle feather on their graduation cap, or by saying your dreads are too long, you can't wrestle, or So we have to look at those policies, we have to talk about those policies, and we have to see each other and meet each other from our different perspectives to move on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Representative Waldron?
Okay, I think I'll lead off with a quote from John Adams in the musical 1776, which was my generation's Hamilton. He said, "It's a revolution, damn it. We're going to have to offend somebody." And when it comes to it, teaching our history, there's a lot of uncomfortable truths that the kids need to be prepared to handle. And Karen, you can complain to the manager all you want. It's not going to change the fact that we're an imperfect nation, and it's the duty of educators to help students understand that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Ware, we'll give you the last word.
I really don't want to end this on a dark note, but I got to tell the truth. So the question that is overarching all of this is America a fundamentally racist nation? Shannon has already announced that the answer to that is yes. And I think that things can get better by having conversations like this. I really, really wish that all the white people in this world were like Shannon, because things would get better. But they're not, because they voted for Donald Trump and they support Donald Trump and they refuse to tell the truth about what's happening. And so while I really, really wish that things would get better, I just don't have any faith that it will. I just think that we have to find a way to persevere in the reality of racism being here. We have to find a way to love and to have joy in the reality of racism being here. Because again, I really, really wish that people were like Shannon. I really, really wish that things would change. I really wish that the world was like you guys, but it's just not. And as long as it's not, I have to find a way to persevere in the reality that I'm in. And so I find joy in all kinds of things, and I find joy in where I am. But the reality is that it's going to be something that I'm going to have to find a way to live with. And so it's important for white people to take this up, to have these difficult conversations, to do the work where they can, to try to convince their grandparents and their cousins and their friends about the reality of racism in this country. But until I begin to see that happening in a really significant kind of way, I'm just not going to lie and make you guys feel good and say that racism is going to get better. I don't feel like it's going to get better. But keep fighting, keep persevering, because it will get better eventually as long as you guys continue to do the work.
Beautiful, beautiful, and well said. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for your contributions tonight. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your thoughts, your opinions, your perspectives. Thank you for taking the time to invigorate our audience with knowledge that we otherwise would not have. And I would like to leave off with something that my mentor, Dr. George Henderson, my teacher from the University of Oklahoma, liked to say at the end of his courses and also at the end of his talks.
That's my dude.
If you don't know Dr. George Henderson, you need to, first of all, look him up. Second of all, and I get no benefit from saying this, but buy his book, Race in the University, because the history that he talks about in that book of the racism that he faced, he and his family in Norman, Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma, is eye-opening and helps us understand our history. And we can never build a future if we don't know our past. But I will leave off with what he likes to say at the end of his courses. If you leave this talk tonight and you choose to make a change and you choose to be an agent of change in the world, I will love you. And even if you choose not to, I will love you anyways. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. and let us move forward towards building a better future for our children and for generations to come, so that we hope one day the dream of Martin Luther King Jr., iconic leader of the civil rights movement, will come true. And let's keep hope alive. Thank you and have a good evening.